Okay, so today I want to let you know that I began drafting the first version of this talk when we were several months into what I would call our own state of exception here in the United States. Like many of you, I found myself immersed in continuous discussion with colleagues, friends, students, and neighbors about the rise of fascism or Nazism, the parallels to the end of the Weimar Republic, and the distinctions between mere authoritarianism and what some contended was a new American fascism. I participated in teach-ins at the University of Michigan, one last April, entitled "What is Fascism and How Does it Work?", focusing my comments on the concerted and calculated dismantling of democracy as a critical prerequisite of fascism's rise. While Tim Snyder warned in the aftermath of Charlottesville that we are hanging here by our teeth to the rule of law, George Prochnik's February New Yorker article reflected poignantly on Stefan Zweig's autobiography, The World of Yesterday, written in 1941 while in exile in New York, noting that he and his contemporaries failed to understand the grave threat that the Nazis had posed at the time. Zweig recalled his misreading of the surging support for the Nazis in the September 1930 elections as a perhaps unwise but fundamentally sound and approvable revolt of youth against the slowness and irresolution of high politics, which kind of sounds like a 1940 definition of populism. Packing their bags for England in early 1934, Stefan and Lotte Zweig realized that they had grasped the dismantling of democracy much too late. The pastness invoked in the title of his memoir encompassed a certain bourgeois sense of security, the memory of lost interwar Republican democracies in Germany and Austria, and Zweig's own dream of a borderless, tolerant Europe. The day after finishing his memoir, Stefan and Lotte Zweig committed suicide in Brazil. Richard J. Evans entitled a recent review essay in The Nation as a warning from history, headlining his piece with the observation that there is more than one way to destroy a democracy. We might interpret this as gesturing towards the right-wing populist advances that have threatened to dissolve fundamental pillars of democracy in favor of acclamatory and authoritarian rule, for example, in Hungary, Turkey, and Poland. Nationalist and right-wing populist mobilizations have inflicted grave damage on American democracy in recent years, and here I start with the Tea Party, have fueled the UK's Brexit campaign, and just 2 months ago rattled the self-confidence of the Bundesrepublik with the electoral surge of the AfD. Over the last months, we've witnessed repeated attempts to weaken or demolish democratic institutions, rights, and practices: free speech, assembly, and freedom of the press, voting rights, the right to a public education, that have made us acutely aware of the dangers to democracy. We have also seen vigorous mobilizations in defense of these rights and in repudiation of racism and Islamophobia in the wake of the Muslim ban and the alt-right neo-Nazi rally and murder in Charlottesville. So I'm showing you pictures that are dissonant with what I'm saying at the moment. These events can't help but form the backdrop for my reflections today, not least because we German historians are continuously called upon, if not to reflect, if not on parallels, then on at least lessons from history, in an intriguing twist in the trajectory of history and memory, at least when one thinks back to Bitburg and the historians' debate of the late 1980s, referring to when Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg and placed a wreath at the grave of SS, Waffen-SS. Germany has figured over the last months, and at least until the elections of September 24th, as a site of a tested and fortified democracy, which matured not least through its engagement with and acceptance of Nazi crimes, as evidenced in the recent fascination within the US with the Stolpersteine, the sidewalk stones that marked the deportation and sites of Jewish residents of those who were deported and then later murdered. Well, Angela Merkel ascended to the position of indisputable leader of Western democracies after Donald Trump's inauguration last January. The German election outcome of September 24th has placed the future of social democracy in Europe more in question than ever, as the Washington Post reflected the day after those elections. So this is the backdrop that it was impossible for me not to think about this while I was writing this. Jan Werner Müller's recent study, What is Populism?, offers a persuasive A persuasive explanation of populism's stark disavowal of representative politics in favor of a moralistic imagination of politics, of anti-pluralism that stakes political claims in the name of the will of the people as a whole. In claiming to represent those estranged or excluded from parliamentary or party politics, populism is sometimes misread as attesting to the strength of democracy. Although populist waves unquestionably ride on what he terms the broken promises of democracy, he argues that populists also seek to conjure up crisis in order to weaken parliamentary and constitutional forms of representation, repudiating institutions as such in favor of a vision of direct democracy in which populists morally delegitimize all those who contest their claim to represent the will of the people. So in considering democracy as a political form that suffers recurrent crises of representation in terms of who is represented and how the terms of inclusion and exclusion are periodically contested and revised, I'm interested in the broader question of how democratic sensibilities are awakened in or articulated by actors and subjects who seek to convene, assemble, defend, or restore democracies, and in the related question of how affinities and sensibilities for democracy become dislodged, damaged, dismantled, or ultimately shattered. I led in 2015 and 2016 a seminar at the German Studies Association meeting on democratic subjectivities, and over a 2-year period I had the opportunity to think comparatively and across disciplines with some 20 other scholars about how democratic sensibilities or subjectivities are historically, politically, and culturally produced. Our explorations focused on the critical junctures of 1918 and 1945-49, when democracies were created under conditions of sudden collapse of governance and profound material, social, and political crises, not least that of political representation. Some of our papers reflected on, as well as on 1968 and the late 70s, and on reunification as moments in which the terms of democratic citizenship and sensibilities were challenged and refigured. Recognizing the slipperiness of the notion of sensibility or subjectivity, seminar participants compared the evidence and forms of representation that let us see, name, and analyze how subjects formed under the messy and often tumultuous conditions of fledgling democracies, not only in their interactions with institutions of governance, but also to sites of cultural and social life, margins and centers, and beyond the boundaries of the state. So I'm telling you this because I personally don't have an expertise to say all that much on the period 1945-49. I am a Weimar historian at the moment. So my case study that I'm going to present to you will be on 1918-19, but I will cast a gaze, or a comparative gaze, towards 45-49. In considering democratic sensibilities in relationship to states of exception, this talk revisits Michael Geyer and Konrad Jarosch's notion of Germany's shattered past that disavowed the linear frameworks of 20th century German history, highlighting instead the moments of rupture and the many creative and destructive ways of making and unmaking society, of putting together and ripping apart social fabric and cultural sensibilities that are, in fact, often not restorable. Geyer and Jarosch point, for example, to the lines of conflict in 20th century Germany that were redrawn time and again over the boundaries and rights of citizenship, and that often ignored, and that are too often ignored in the face of the overwhelming legacy of German authoritarianism. Quote, the cultural process of conversion to democracy, the transformation of values or lifestyle, and the emotional attachments to democracy and citizenship, they argue, has remained under-researched and under-theorized compared to the depth and sophistication of work on Germany's various dictatorships. Although my own recent work has focused on 1918 and 1920, our seminar prompted a comparison of the particular kinds of democratic sensibilities that emerged in the process of founding Germany's 2 post-war democracies, which I termed in the course of that seminar sudden democracies. Sudden democracy, even if popularly summoned as in 1918, must nonetheless be improvised and invented as states of exception crumble, as juridical and constitutional changes transform the disenfranchised or partially enfranchised into full citizens, or that restore dissolved citizenships to those who lost or forfeited them. So the former case, transforming disenfranchised or partially enfranchised into full citizens, applies more aptly to 1918-19, and to restore dissolved citizenships to those who lost or forfeited them works well for 1945-48. These are both processes that often take place in the absence of traditions or in open conflict with past forms of belonging. The speed with which sudden democratic frameworks are built is often compelled by external conditions: military collapse and defeat, negotiations over the terms of peace, occupation and the state of emergency, and dire need for material relief of the civilian population. We might understand the inception of Weimar democracy as an eruption, while the work of Jennifer Kapczynski, Johannes von Moltke, Sean Forner, Jennifer Fay, and others of the post-45 period suggests that the democracy that emerged after 1945 in West Germany is better understood, in fact, in the terms of conversion, a process that began, as they suggest, in the early months of Allied occupation and that lasted well into the 1950s. So this notion of sudden democracy takes seriously the broken character of defeat or revolution that calls forth new forms of governance and political representation under the conditions of emergency. And it seeks to unsettle the powerful presumptions of continuity in German history that regard ruptures as usually shattering only the political surface, while the social ground scarcely changes or is quickly restored to its previous structures and patterns. The deep conviction, even in my own field of gender history, that wartime transformations, for example, followed by defeat, revolution, and the founding of democracy, were somehow reversed or rendered insignificant by a return to the pre-war family, divisions of labor, and gender hierarchies, presumes precisely this disjuncture between a political institutional surface and the deeper socioeconomic or familial structures, overlooking thereby consciousness, mentality, emotion, experience, and action that constitutes what I've termed sensibility. What is notable in the comparison of Germany's two post-war democracies is the disavowal and disconnection that characterizes their relationship between the two democracies. The sensibilities of Weimar democracy left little trace in the fostering of post-war democracies. They're not only two sudden democracies, they're two democracies that don't share a legacy. The Weimar past was not absent, Sebastian Ulrich has argued in his book Weimar Complex, but hung over the Federal Republic's beginning like a very long shadow, the shadow that is democracy's catastrophic failure. Moreover, even though the former adherents of the Weimar coalition, that is Social Democrats, Catholics, and left liberals, sought in rebuilding Germany after 1945 to undo the damaging legacy of Weimar, fostered by Nazi propaganda, Ulrich argues that these attempts largely failed. Instead, the Republic's shortcomings served among large parts of the post-war West German population to justify their own previous support for the Nazis. In fact, the success and self-confidence of the emergent Federal Republic would ultimately depend on its ability to distance its new democracy in form and content from the crisis-ridden Republic of Weimar. In search of democratic political traditions in which to anchor the new Federal Republic, West German politicians and intellectuals thus looked back to 1848. Its 100th anniversary was marked by celebration in 1948, while the 30th anniversary of Weimar's founding went largely unmarked. The GDR, by contrast, sought to embrace and enshrine the lessons of Weimar through the anti-fascist democratic revolution that it sought to fulfill after 1945. So these are some very big frameworks, and now I turn to my case study of 1918-19, the case study of democratic sensibilities that emerge from my own research and which will be my main focus. Giorgio Agamben defines the state of exception, which is one of my key words, as one in which law encompassed living beings by means of its own suspension. So although the Third Reich is his paradigmatic state of exception, Agamben also cites examples of states of exception in Europe that began with the extension of the military's wartime powers into the civil sphere, followed by the suspension of the Constitution or constitutional norms that protect individual liberties, which then merged into the juridical phenomenon of a formal state of exception. This term provides a broad framework for analyzing the transformation of state and civil society in Germany and Central Europe during and after the First World War. Martin Geyer has recently argued that the institution of Belagerungszustand, the state of siege anchored in Prussian legal and military traditions, had been conceived for states of extreme emergency, but was enacted almost without limits in Germany during the First World War, allowing the proliferation of rule by decree in a culture of decisionism that would have profound consequences for wartime military rulers. Geyer also notes that the linguistic shift from Belagerungszustand, from state of siege to state of exception, took place, and that Ausnahmezustand was actually a word used frequently during the later years of the war and in the Weimar Republic, and it was understood as indicating a more moderate form of enforcing security by means of the military, the police, and political institutions. So just to flash and let you see something else, to give us a glimpse of how this political language of state of exception actually was reflected in political culture after the war. This is a quite offensive poster by Karl Arnold, who was rendering the state of exception in 1922 at the peak of the social and economic and political crisis of the French-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr and the inflation. So we could spend the rest of the time analyzing that. It's quite intriguing, but my point is mainly to show you this is not a vocab that I'm importing and sort of placing on top of this project. So the state of siege on the German home front, initiated in August 1914 and expanded into a military dictatorship by the summer of 1917, and dissolved into a new and unprecedented state of exception with the collapse of Germany's war efforts and the collapse of the Kaiser's rule. The mobilization of German civilians in defense of the nation in 1914 and their apparent consent to the Burgfrieden, that is the civil peace, and to the state of siege, constituted the opening acts in the wartime state of exception. The extensive wave of strikes, revolts, and revolutions that erupted in Germany and across Central Europe during the last 2 years of the war had national, subnational, and transnational dimensions as the long-term social costs of war and the mass conscription and militarization of citizens and of subjects without citizenship rekindled pre-war claims of national and civic belonging, lending them a new urgency. Claims to participatory citizenship became a formative part of the imagination of the future in the course of 1916 to 1918, expressed in civilian protests, worker strikes, soldiers' dissent, and growing demands for peace, bread, and democracy. Within Germany, the Prussian three-class suffrage system constituted the burning citizenship question of the pre-war period. It had remained an unsettled question when the war began in 1914 and bore directly upon the relationships between the Wilhelmine state and the expanding civic publics, including many soldiers called upon to serve and die for the empire. The gradual withdrawal of citizens' consent to war through everyday acts of disavowal and protest from 1916 on infused pre-war visions and claims of citizenship with demands for bread, coal, and higher wages that intermingled with desires for new forms of political representation and participation and for peace without annexations. Citizenship, the right to political participation, was increasingly imagined as the currency in which the state would recompense both civilians and soldiers for the burdens it had asked them to bear.